Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here today with a play by A. Edward Newton. It's titled Dr. Johnson, and it's a play, but it's not the sort of play that I would want to see performed. I think the average theater goer would be bored to tears if they had to sit through this play. But as a piece of literature to be read, I quite enjoyed it. It is essentially long scenes of dialogue, people sitting in rooms and speaking to each other. Now, A. Edward Newton was an early 20th century book collector, essayist, literary critic, and he was a great collector of the works of Dr. Samuel Johnson. Now, of course, many of us know Dr. Johnson through Boswell's Life of Johnson, which you can see my set back there. And much of the dialogue is sourced from Boswell's Life of Johnson, and Boswell appears as a character in the play. And so it's quite enjoyable in that aspect, quite enjoyable for someone like myself who enjoyed Boswell's Life of Johnson, because he's sort of bringing many of the characters, many of the people, real life people that you see in Life of Johnson to life in his play. And this is a very beautiful edition here. I ordered it. One, because it's signed by the author, by A. Edward Newton, but two, because I saw the pictures and this delightful pattern on the boards. It's not in great condition. As you can see, it's been kind of mangled and bumped at the top. And the paper is a little bit brittle on the edges. It's deckled edges, and in some spots on those deckled edges it's a little bit brittle, and I've been getting kind of covered in little bits of dried out paper as I've read. But it's got some great illustrations. We have these portraits all throughout the book, which are quite nice. Portraits of the people we encounter. Everyone from of course, Dr. Johnson, Boswell, Oliver Goldsmith, Mrs. Thrale makes an appearance, of course. Other authors like Mary Wollstonecraft makes a small appearance. Fanny Burney is in a couple of the acts. Sir Joshua Reynolds. It's a play in 5 acts. But Newton knew that it was an indulgence. He begins with this argument here where he admits that there's not a lot of plot, hardly any plot at all. It really is just people arriving and sitting in parlors and drinking tea and having these conversations. And the conversations are made up of real recorded dialogue, dialogue that was recorded in A Life of Johnson, dialogue recorded elsewhere perhaps. He doesn't reveal the source of every bit of dialogue, but he does say that most of it is in fact, rooted in fact. But he also says he's taken liberties, and that some of the things that Dr. Johnson says are things that he could imagine him saying. He supposes, after immersing himself in the literature of Johnson, and Johnson through the eyes of Boswell, he imagines that Johnson would have said such things on certain subjects. But as I said, it's 5 acts, and we begin at his home in Go Square, and then we go to Mrs. Thrale's house, and we end with Johnson's death. So it really is all through his life. And I believe it was Bolt's house. I'm trying to remember if that's where he died. We have a description here of these settings. Yeah, Bolt Court. That's situated not far from Go Square, where he had been living at the start of the play. But yeah, so 5 acts. Delicious dialogue. It's definitely good for armchair reading. If you're a fan of Boswell's Life of Johnson or interested in Dr. Johnson at all, This is a great work to pick up. And you can just tell it's an absolute indulgence on A. Edward Newton's part. He was so, I guess you would say, he was so obsessed with the works of Dr. Johnson that he even had Dr. Johnson's teapot, his silver teapot, as part of his collection. And when Newton's library went up for sale at auction in 1946, I think it was 1946, that rings properly, sometime in the 1940s. When that went up for sale, Dr. Johnson's teapot was a part of what was for sale, as was a whole slew of manuscripts and books written by Johnson. And I'll just show you some curiosities here. So there is Newton's signature written there in what appears to be fountain pen. And this is copy 139 of 585 copies. This is a handmade paper edition. So there's Newton's signature. And then I had to pause and look at this because I was like, is that more pen or is that the facsimile printed in? And I'm 99.8% sure this is facsimile printed in and not handwritten, although it's deceptive at first, but because there is, cut off of part of a letter at the top, I've come to the conclusion this is facsimile printed. But this is some thoughts by Christopher Morley. Christopher Morley was the author of a number of books, including novels, Parnassus on Wheels, The Haunted Bookshop, in the 1920s and 1930s. But he was a friend of A. Edward Newton, and so it would make perfect sense to see Morley quoted at the start of this book. But what it is I guess you would call it an endorsement. It was the sort of thing you might see printed on the back of a book jacket nowadays, or perhaps in a literary review. But this is what Christopher Morley had to say on a portrait of Dr. Samuel Johnson, now owned by A.E.N. So A. Edward Newton. And so I'm assuming this is that portrait here. So he owned the original portrait of Johnson. But he says, "This is the Dr. Johnson of the prayers, that great tormented craggy man who poured his sloth, his loving kindness, and his cares in agonized petitions to the Lord. O rough, pure, stubborn, troubled soul, for whom a smile of special tenderness we keep, who prayed for strength to to regulate my room, and preservation from immoderate sleep. If life brought Dr. Johnson to his knees, it may bring others also, if you please. Bachelors of Arts and LLDs." Christopher Morley. So it's a bit of a poem there. And I think what he is obviously referring to are some of the prayers that Dr. Johnson composed himself. I suppose it was, well, I don't know if it was fairly common. It was certainly a practice of Johnson, I think, to compose his own prayers. And evidently, those prayers in this portrait were a bit of an inspiration here. But overall, it's just a beautiful book here. As I said, I enjoyed the play, touching on almost every conceivable subject, literature, politics. Here's Oliver Goldsmith's portrait here. And let's see if I can find, here's another, no, I don't want to show you that one. I mean, it's not a bad one. Here, I'm going to show you Mrs. Siddons. I think that's who we're looking at. Yeah, Mrs. Siddons. I had a moment of doubt. There is Mrs. Siddons who makes an appearance here. But that is the book. I enjoyed the reading experience, and it's extra special that we've got Newton's signature in the front here. So there's that. If you've read this one, do let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all again soon.